Hey everyone, Laszlo Montgomery once again bringing you another episode taken from the olden days of China. Well, not that olden, 19th century. In the first half of the program, we're going to finish up the final days in China for Robert Fortune. In this, his inaugural trip, we were treated over the last 4 episodes to the descriptions of his travels in Guangdong, Fujian, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu from 1843 to 1846. In this final installment from his first book, 3 Years' Wanderings in the Northern Provinces of China, we're treated to Fortune's swashbuckling exploits fighting pirates off the coast of Fujian province. Your guess is as good as mine as far as how much of what he describes is true, but it's somewhat exciting, if highly unbelievable. These pirates were the scourge of the East China Sea, and any seafaring vessel sailing along the coast from Zhejiang to Guangzhou lived with this threat. I featured the pirate queen Zheng Yisao in a China History podcast episode. These South China Sea pirates were no Pirates of the Caribbean or even Penzance. Anyway, this story, told by Fortune, offers a nice little vignette of a well-worn theme of Westerner goes to China, saves the day, rides off into the sunset. It all opens up in the capital of Fujian province, Fuzhou. That's where the main river of the province, the Min, empties out into the East China Sea. In this episode, Fortune is attempting to get passage from Fuzhou to Zhoushan off the coast of Ningbo. His ultimate destination is Shanghai, where he intended to catch a vessel, sailing to Hong Kong and then on to London. From June of 1843 to May of 1846, Robert Fortune wandered all over the regions adjacent to the newly opened treaty ports. The Horticultural Society of London, who sent him there, was going to be the recipient of all kinds of seeds, plant specimens, and various other new natural discoveries that Robert Fortune picked up along the way. It was a success beyond everyone's wildest imaginations. And for Fortune, too. As I mentioned before, he showed up on the radar of the largest corporation in the world, who had this dangerous and dubiously illegal scheme to obtain, through nefarious means, all the 1,000-year-old secrets contained within the most renowned tea-producing regions in China. And this book that we've all enjoyed together these past several episodes was written right after he got back to England, and it was published a year later in 1847. So anyways, this episode is a little more entertaining than the others. It certainly has more drama and excitement. I hope you enjoy it.
At the time when I visited Fuzhou, although it was open to the British as a place of trade and had a British consul, it was little known in a mercantile point of view. The entrance to the River Min was described as extremely difficult and dangerous, and consequently few foreign vessels ventured to touch at this port. When, therefore, my botanical researches were completed and I was ready to return north to Shanghai, I was obliged to apply for a passage in a Chinese junk, a whole fleet of which were to sail in a few days for Ningbo and Jiapu. Knowing the dislike and jealousy which most of the natives manifest towards foreigners, I had some doubt whether I should be able to induce them to take me as a passenger. And in that event, I had determined to go down to the mouth of the river and, sans cérémonie, get on board whether they consented or not. I was therefore agreeably surprised when, on sending my servant to make inquiries as to the time when they were likely to sail, he returned, bringing with him the captain and some of the sailors, who were all not only willing, but most anxious that I should go with them. The principal part of the cargo carried by the Ningbo and Jiapu junks is wood. This is stowed on deck and also lashed firmly to the gunwales and sides with large ropes of bamboo, which are of great strength. Several hundreds of these vessels may be seen loading at the port of Fuzhou, particularly in the summer season, when the monsoon is fair for their voyage home. The mandarins are extremely jealous of so large a fleet and will not allow them to carry guns, even for their own defense, evidently fearing that some day or other these might be turned against the government. The consequence of this regulation is that these poor sailors and all they possess on board often fall an easy prey to the pirates who abound all along this coast. When the cargo was completed, the captain of the junk came to inform me that he was ready to start and requested me to come on board. Whilst I was packing up my luggage, he began to examine my firearms very minutely and said to me, "I hope your gun is a good one, and that you have plenty of powder and shot." "What is your reason for putting this question?" said I. "I am sure we shall have nothing to shoot in our voyage up the coast." "Oh, yes, you will," answered he. "We are very likely to be attacked by the Jondos, who swarm outside amongst the islands." "Who are the Jondos?" said I to my servant, never having heard the name before. "Oh, they are pirates," said he, "and we are all very much frightened at them." "Nonsense," I exclaimed. "No pirates will attack us, and if they do, they will repent it." At this time, I had no idea that the coast was so infested with these lawless characters, and I put it all down to the cowardice of my informants. As soon as I got on board, we hove up the anchor and dropped down to the mouth of the Min. We here found a large fleet of junks, about 170 sail, all, like ourselves, loaded with wood and ready to start for the northern parts of Ningbo and Jiapu. That evening, a meeting of the captains was held on board our vessel, and a deputation appointed to wait upon the mandarins to request them to send a convoy of war junks to protect the fleet from the pirates. These negotiations were carried on for several days, but the demands of the mandarins were so exorbitant that the junk people would not comply with them, and it was at last determined to sail without the convoy. Just as they came to this decision, the wind changed and blew a gale from the north for 3 days, when it veered round to the south and blew nearly as strong from that quarter, and for the same space of time. These vessels never go to sea in stormy weather, even if the wind is fair, and, what with gales of wind and negotiations with mandarins, I was obliged to content myself with a junk life for a fortnight at the mouth of the river. As long as I enjoyed health, I got on well enough, but the exposure during the past summer, particularly at Fuzhou, had gradually undermined my constitution, and the fever, which was probably kept off for a certain time by bodily exertion, now seized me and compelled me to take to my cot, where I lay for a number of days, insensible at intervals. At times, when consciousness returned, I certainly thought that my travels were drawing to a close, and that my grave would be a lonely one on the banks of the Min. It seemed hard for me to die in a land of strangers, without a friend or countryman to close my eyes or follow me to my last resting place. And home, friends, and country, how doubly dear did they seem to me then. The wind having been fair for several days, and the weather appearing settled, the captain of the junk came down to the place where I lay, and told me they intended to sail on the following morning. He again inquired if I had my gun and pistols in proper order, and plenty of powder and ball. Still imagining that they were exaggerating the dangers of the voyage, I laughed and said, "Do not be afraid, I have everything in order, and I will undertake to beat off any pirates who may attack us." Nevertheless, I clearly saw that both captain and sailors were really uneasy about the voyage, and would have been very glad of another gale to afford a pretext for deferring it a little longer. They had, however, no further excuse for delay, and it was settled that the whole fleet should sail early the next day. The Chinese sailor never goes to sea without first presenting an offering to the gods to propitiate them in order that the voyage may be a speedy and successful one. Accordingly, on this day, the cabin of our junk was set in order, and the tables covered with dishes of pork, mutton, fruits, and vegetables. Candles and incense were burned upon the tables for a short time, and the whole business had something solemn and imposing about it. The cook, who seemed to be the high priest, conducted all the ceremonies. On other days, as well as this, it was part of his duty to light the candles in the little temple where the gods were kept, as well as to burn incense and prostrate himself before them. Early on the following morning, the whole fleet was in motion, starting all together for the sake of mutual protection. The wind and tide were both fair, and we proceeded along the coast with great rapidity, and were soon out of sight of the Min and its beautiful and romantic scenery. The plan of mutual protection soon seemed to be abandoned, and the vessels separated into 3s and 4s, each getting on as well and as fast as it could. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and when we were some 50 or 60 miles from the Min, the captain and pilot came hurriedly down to my cabin and informed me they saw a number of Jandus right ahead, lying in wait for us. I ridiculed the idea and told them they imagined every junk they saw to be a pirate, but they still maintained that they were so, and I therefore considered it prudent to be prepared for the worst. I got out of bed, ill and feverish as I was, and carefully examined my firearms, clearing the nipples of my gun and pistols, and putting on fresh caps. I also rammed down a ball upon the top of each charge of shot in my gun, put a pistol in each side pocket, and patiently waited for the result. By the aid of a small pocket telescope, I could see as the nearest junk approached that her deck was crowded with men. I then had no longer any doubts regarding her intentions. The pilot, an intelligent old man, now came up to me and said that he thought resistance was of no use. I might manage to beat off one junk, or even two, but that I had no chance with 5 of them. Being at that time in no mood to take advice or be dictated to by anyone, I ordered him off to look after his own duty. I knew perfectly well that if we were taken by the pirates, I had not the slightest chance of escape, for the first thing they would do would be to knock me on the head and throw me overboard, as they would deem it dangerous to themselves were I to get away. At the same time, I must confess I had little hopes of being able to beat off such a number, and devoutly wished myself anywhere rather than where I was. The scene around me was a strange one. The captain, pilot, and 1 or 2 native passengers were taking up the boards of the cabin floor and putting their money and other valuables out of sight amongst the ballast. The common sailors, too, had their copper cash, or chien, to hide, and the whole place was in a state of bustle and confusion. When all their more valuable property was hidden, they began to make some preparations for defense. Baskets of small stones were brought up from the hold and emptied out on the most convenient parts of the deck, and were intended to be used as firearms when the pirates came to close quarters. This is a common mode of defense in various parts of China, and is effectual enough when the enemy has only similar weapons to bring against them. But on the coast of Fujian, where we were now, all the pirate junks carried guns, and consequently a whole deck-load of stones could be of very little use against them. During the general bustle, I missed my own servant for a short time. When he returned to me, he had made such a change in his appearance that I did not recognize him. He was literally clothed in rags, which he had borrowed from the sailors, all of whom had also put on their very worst clothes. When I asked him the reason of this change in his outward man, he told me that the pirates only made those persons prisoners who had money and were likely to pay handsomely for their ransom, and that they would not think it worth their while to lay hold of a man in rags. I was surrounded by several of the crew, who might as well be called Job's comforters, some suggesting one thing and some another, and many proposed that we should bring the junk round and run back to the Min. The nearest pirate was now within 200 or 300 yards of us, and putting her helm down, gave us a broadside from her guns. All was now dismay and consternation on board our junk, and every man ran below except 2 who were at the helm. I expected every moment that these also would leave their post, and then we should have been an easy prey to the pirates. "My gun is nearer you than those of the Jandos," said I to the 2 men, "and if you move from the helm, depend on it, I will shoot you." The poor fellows looked very uncomfortable, but I suppose thought they had better stand the fire of the pirates than mine, and kept at their post. Large boards, heaps of old clothes, mats, and things of that sort which were at hand, were thrown up to protect us from the shot, and as we had every stitch of sail set and a fair wind, we were going through the water at the rate of 7 or 8 miles an hour. The shot from the pirates fell considerably short of us, and I was therefore enabled to form an opinion of the range and power of their guns, which was of some use to me. Assistance from our cowardly crew was quite out of the question, for there was not a man amongst them brave enough to use the stones which had been brought on deck, and which perhaps might have been of some little use when the pirates came nearer. The fair wind and all the press of sail which we had crowded on the junk proved of no use, for our pursuers, who had much faster sailing vessels, were gaining rapidly upon us. Again the nearest pirate fired upon us. I still remained quiet, as I had determined not to fire a single shot until I was quite certain my gun would take effect. The third broadside, which followed this, came whizzing over our heads and through the sails, without, however, wounding either the men at the helm or myself. The pirates now seemed quite sure of their prize, and came down upon us, hooting and yelling like demons, at the same time loading their guns, and evidently determined not to spare their shot. This was a moment of intense interest. The plan which I had formed from the first was now about to be put to the proof, and if the pirates were not the cowards which I believed them to be, nothing could save us from falling into their hands. Their fearful yells seem to be ringing in my ears even now, after this lapse of time, and when I am on the other side of the globe. The nearest junk was now within 30 yards of ours. Their guns were now loaded, and I knew that the next discharge would completely rake our decks. "Now," said I to our helmsman, "keep your eyes fixed on me, and the moment you see me fall flat on the deck, you must do the same, or you will be shot." I knew that the pirate, who was now on our stern, could not bring his guns to bear upon us without putting his helm down and bringing his gangway at right angles with our stern, as his guns were fired from the gangway. I therefore kept a sharp eye upon his helmsman, and the moment I saw him putting the helm down, I ordered our steersmen to fall flat on their faces behind some wood, and at the same moment did so myself. We had scarcely done so when bang, bang went their guns, and the shot came whizzing close over us, splintering the wood about us in all directions. Fortunately, none of us were struck. "Now, Mandarin, now, they are quite close enough," cried out my companions, who did not wish to have another broadside like the last. I, being of the same opinion, raised myself above the high stern of our junk, and while the pirates were not more than 20 yards from us, hooting and yelling, I raked their decks fore and aft with shot and ball from my double-barreled gun. Had a thunderbolt fallen amongst them, they could not have been more surprised. Doubtless many were wounded, and probably some killed. At all events, the whole of the crew, not fewer than 40 or 50 men, who, a moment before, crowded the deck, disappeared in a marvelous manner, sheltering themselves behind the bulwarks or lying flat on their faces. They were so completely taken by surprise that their junk was left without a helmsman, her sails flapping in the wind, and as we were still carrying all sail and keeping on our right course, they were soon left a considerable way astern. Another was now bearing down upon us as boldly as his companion had done, and commenced firing in the same manner. Having been so successful with the first, I determined to follow the same plan with this one, and to pay no attention to his firing until he should come to close quarters. The plot now began to thicken, for the first junk had gathered way again and was following in our wake, although keeping at a respectful distance, and 3 others, although still further distant, were making for the scene of action as fast as they could. In the meantime, the second was almost alongside and continued giving us a broadside now and then with their guns. Watching their helm as before, we sheltered ourselves as well as we could. At the same time, my poor fellows who were staring kept begging and praying that I would fire into our pursuers as soon as possible, or we should all be killed. As soon as they came within 20 or 30 yards of us, I gave them the contents of both barrels, raking their decks as before. This time the helmsman fell, and doubtless several others were wounded. In a minute or two I could see nothing but boards and shields, which were held up by the pirates to protect themselves from my firing. Their junk went up into the wind for want of a helmsman, and was soon left some distance behind us. While I was watching this vessel, our men called out to me that there was another close on our lee bow, which I had not observed on account of our mainsail. Luckily, however, it proved to be a Ningpo wood junk like ourselves, which the pirates had taken a short time before, but which, although manned by these rascals, could do us no harm, having no guns. The poor Ningpo crew, whom I could plainly see on board, seemed to be very much downhearted and frightened. I was afterwards informed that, when a junk is captured, all the principal people, such as the captain, pilot, and passengers, are taken out of her, and a number of the pirates go on board and take her into some of their dens amongst the islands and keep her there until a heavy ransom is paid, both for the junk and the people. Sometimes, when a ransom cannot be obtained, the masts and spars and everything else which is of any value are taken out of her, and she is set on fire. 2 other piratical junks, which had been following in our wake for some time, when they saw what had happened, would not venture any nearer, and at last, much to my satisfaction, the whole set of them bore away. Now was the time for my heroical companions to come from their hiding place, which they did with great alacrity, hooting and yelling as the pirates had done before, and in derision calling on them to come back and renew the fight. The stones, too, were now boldly seized and thrown after the retreating junks, reaching to almost a 10th part of the distance, and a stranger, who had not seen these gentry before, would have supposed them the bravest men in existence. Fortunately, the pirates did not think proper to accept the challenge. With the captain, pilot, crew, and passengers, I was now one of the greatest and best men in existence. They actually came and knelt before me, as to some superior being, and expressed their deep and lasting gratitude, which, however, did not last long. The sun was now setting in all his glory behind the hills of Fujian, and many of the more devout amongst the passengers and crew did not fail to bow low in adoration and thankfulness to this supposed deity for their escape out of the hands of the pirates. Shortly after nightfall, we arrived at one of the safe anchorages where the mandarins are too strong for the lawless bands which infest the other parts of the coast. On the following morning, we again got under way and proceeded the whole day without molestation. In the evening, we arrived at another safe anchorage, or place of rendezvous, but the security at this place consisted in the number and strength of the junks actually at anchor there, and not in the fare which the pirates entertained for the government. When we reached this place, the night was fine, and, as it was nearly full moon, it was almost as light as day. The tide, too, was just turning in our favor, and as I was most anxious to proceed on our voyage, I did everything in my power to induce them to go on. It was of no use, however, for as soon as we reached the anchorage and found a large fleet of junks, the anchor was dropped, and they determined to stay there all night. I felt very much annoyed, but saw it was no use to grumble, and went quietly to bed. In less than an hour from this time, and before I had fallen asleep, hearing a stir upon deck, I inquired what was the cause, and found that we were getting under way. This was agreeable news, but as I could not imagine what had caused them to change their minds so soon, I went upon deck to see what was going on. Our people, it appeared, had gone to sleep the moment our anchor was down. Shortly after this, the other junks, which, it turned out, were only waiting for the rise of the tide to enter some river in the vicinity, had all weighed anchor and gone off. All on board were now in great consternation, lest the pirates should come down upon us whilst at anchor, and no time was lost in getting it up and proceeding on our voyage, much, of course, to my satisfaction. On the following day, late in the afternoon, when I was laid up in my bed with fever, the captain came hurriedly down and informed me that another fleet of pirates were in sight and evidently lying in wait for us. I was obliged to get up, ill as I was, and when I got on deck I could see, by the aid of my telescope, 6 junks coming out from amongst the islands under the main land, and evidently bearing down towards us. This time I was not so skeptical as the last. After having once seen these rascally vessels, there was no mistaking others of the same class as they came sneaking out of the bays. Their clipper-built hulls, the cut of their sails, their raking masts, and the crowd of fellows who lined their decks, all told the business they were after. It was therefore evident that we must prepare for another encounter. It now struck me that perhaps I might be able to deceive the pirates with regard to our strength, as I was afraid that I might not again be so successful with them, particularly if they found out that there was only one foreigner on board. Knowing that they have a great dread of foreigners and their guns, my object was to make them believe that there were a number of us, and that we were well armed. For this purpose I got up all the spare clothes I had, and put them on the least Chinese-looking Chinamen on board. At the same time, I desired them to collect all the short levers which they use for hoisting their sails, and which at a distance would look not unlike firearms, particularly if the deception was assisted by the report of a double-barreled gun. Everything looked promising, and I thought my recruits were likely to be of some service to me. But when the nearest pirate, who had been coming fast down upon us, gave us a broadside, it was too much for my Chinamen, who were instantly panic-struck, threw down their arms, and ran below, and, added to this, I had again to threaten the men at the helm, who seemed half inclined to follow the example of the others, so I now prepared for the worst. The pirates came on, firing at intervals, as the others had done, and I followed my former plan of watching their movements until they were near enough for my gun to tell upon them with fearful precision. Their shot was now flying about our ears and riddling our sails, and they came on in their usual noisy manner, perfectly unconscious of what I had in store for their reception. For the last time, the helm of the nearest junk was put down, when we instantly fell flat on our faces and allowed the shot to pass over us. As soon as their last gun was fired, and before they had time to load again, I poured the contents of my gun amongst them fore and aft, raking the deck as I had done before. This took them completely by surprise, and we were still under a heavy press of sail. We were soon a considerable way ahead of them. 2 others of the fleet came up and fired some shots at us, but the whole of them evidently imagined that a number of foreigners were on board of our junk, a belief which doubtless had a great deal to do with the success which attended my efforts. At length, darkness coming on, they gave up the pursuit and bore away from us, and in 2 hours more we arrived at a safe anchorage. The fever, which I had scarcely felt during all this excitement, now returned with greater violence, and I was heartily glad to go below and turn into my bed. During the night I heard a great noise on board, but was too feverish and weak to make any inquiries as to the cause. In the morning my servant informed me that it was occasioned by the arrival of 3 junks during the night, which had been chased to the entrance of the harbor by the pirates. There had, he said, originally been 4 in company, but one of them had been taken. The soldiers on board these junks had not been so fortunate as we had been, for several of them were severely wounded, and I was now asked to extract the balls. The wounds were large and ragged, owing to the iron shot which the Chinese use in their guns. I advised the wounded men to hurry on to Zhoushan, where they would get good medical advice. Up to 9 o'clock in the morning, although the wind and tide were both favorable, there were no signs of the junks getting under way. I therefore sent for the captain and inquired if it was not his intention to proceed. He told me that he had had a meeting with the captains of the other vessels and that they had determined to get a convoy of war junks from the Mandarin before they went on. Being now within 80 or 90 miles of Zhoushan, I could easily hire a small boat for that distance, and therefore said to the captain, "Very well then, I shall leave you here, as I am very unwell and anxious to get to Zhoushan as soon as possible." "Go," said I, turning to my servant, "and engage a boat to take me to Zhoushan and bring it here as soon as you can." When he was about to leave the vessel, several of the crew gathered round him and attempted to persuade him not to go. Anxious to serve his countrymen, although at my expense, he loitered about for a little while and then came back and informed me that it was no use going on shore, as I should not be able to engage a boat to take me so far. As I had been informed by one of the shore people who had come on board that plenty of boats were to be had on hire, I felt annoyed at his deceit and threatened to punish him if he did not start immediately and bring a boat off. When he saw that I was determined, he turned sulkily away, jumped into a sampan, and procured a boat without the slightest difficulty. The captain and crew now crowded round me, begging me not to leave them, and offering to get up their anchor and proceed at once. Although my destination was Zhoushan, I had taken my passage for Ningbo, as all the wood junks were bound either for that port or Jiapu. On their begging me to stay, I told them that unless they would sail into Zhoushan harbor and leave me there as they passed, I would proceed in the small boat, as I was anxious to get there as soon as possible in order to obtain medicine and advice. "Oh," said they, "if you will only go with us, we will run into Zhoushan harbor and leave you there before we cross over to Ningbo." Upon this assurance, I agreed to accompany them. The captains of the other junks now came to me and asked me if I would undertake to protect them all from the attacks of the pirates, as, if so, they would get under way and go with us also. Upon my telling them that I could not undertake to do this, they told me they must wait until some arrangement could be made with the mandarins, as they were afraid to proceed alone. We therefore left them at anchor and proceeded on our voyage. During the day, we frequently saw suspicious-looking craft, which were pronounced by the crew to be jandos, but none of them were near enough to attack us. Late in the afternoon, as we approached Kato Point, a promontory of the mainland near Zhoushan, we met a large fleet of merchant junks sailing together for mutual protection on their way down. Some of them came alongside us and made anxious inquiries regarding the jandos and how many of them they might expect to meet with. Our people did not fail to give them an exaggerated account of the number we had seen and fought with, and the news did not appear greatly to delight them. During the night, the tide turned against us, and as the wind, although fair, was light, we were obliged to anchor until morning. When I went on deck at daylight the following morning, I found we were just under Kato Point and only a few miles from Zhoushan harbor. The land was well known to me, having been frequently there before. It was the most welcome sight which had met my eyes for many a long day, and I was thankful indeed to the Almighty for my escape from the pirates. Whilst the men were heaving up the anchor, my old friends, the captain and pilot, came below, bolder and in much better spirits than heretofore, and informed me with the greatest coolness that they had changed their minds about going into the harbor of Zhoushan, that I must go over with them to Ningbo, from whence I could easily return in a small boat for Zhoushan. I felt very much nettled at this conduct, which, considering that I had saved their junk from being taken by the pirates on 2 separate occasions, was most ungrateful. I reproached them with this ingratitude, telling them that, as they were now safe from the Chandos, they imagined they could do with me just as they pleased. But you never deceived yourselves more, added I. You may show as much ingratitude as you please, but I shall take care that you fulfill the promise you made to me yesterday, and take me into the harbor of Zhoushan before you go over to Ningbo. Look here, you see this gun and these pistols? They are all loaded. You know what effects they produced upon the Jandos. Take care they are not turned against yourselves. Englishmen never allow promises which have been made to them to be broken with impunity. I know the way into Zhoushan Harbor as well as you do, and when the anchor is up, I shall stand at the helm, and if the pilot attempts to steer for Ningbo, he must take the consequence. This threat had the desired effect, and the trembling varlets landed me safely at Zhoushan in the course of the forenoon. What with the fever and the excitement of the last few days, I was in a most deplorable condition when I reached Zhoushan. But as the greater part of my collections were in the country near Shanghai, I was most anxious to ascertain in what state they were, and, finding an English vessel about to sail for the Yangzi River, I immediately crawled on board, and having a fair wind, we soon reached our destination. I was kindly received by my friend Mr. Mackenzie, and under the skillful treatment of Dr. Kirk, the fever gradually left me. Amongst the more important of the acquisitions which I made in the vicinity of Shanghai, I must not forget to mention a fine and large variety of peach, which comes into the markets there about the middle of August, and remains in perfection for about 10 days. It is grown in the peach orchards a few miles to the south of the city, and it is quite a usual thing to see peaches of this variety 11 inches in circumference and 12 ounces in weight. This is probably what some writers call the Peking peach, about which such exaggerated stories have been told. Trees of the Shanghai variety are now in the garden of the Horticultural Society of London. The whole of my plants from the districts of Fuzhou, Zhoushan, and Ningbo being brought together at Shanghai, I got them packed, and on the 10th of October left the north of China for Hong Kong and England. As I went down the river, I could not but look around me with pride and satisfaction, for in this part of the country I had found the finest plants in my collections. It is only the patient botanical collector, the object of whose unintermitted labor is the introduction of the more valuable trees and shrubs of other countries into his own, who can appreciate what I then felt. When we arrived at Hong Kong, I divided my collections and dispatched 8 glazed cases of living plants for England. The duplicates of these and many others I reserved to take home under my own care. And then went up to Canton and took my passage for London in the ship John Cooper. 18 glazed cases, filled with the most beautiful plants of northern China, were placed upon the poop of the ship, and we sailed on the 22nd of December. After a long but favorable voyage, we anchored in the Thames on the 6th of May, 1846. The plants arrived in excellent order and were immediately conveyed to the garden of the Horticultural Society at Chiswick. Already many of those which I first imported have found their way to the principal gardens in Europe, and at the present time, October 20th, 1846, the Anemone japonica is in full bloom in the garden of the Society at Chiswick, as luxuriant and beautiful as it ever grew on the graves of the Chinese near the ramparts of Shanghai.
So that ends Mr. Robert Fortune's first book, Wanderings Through the Northern Provinces of China. You know, I couldn't for the life of me figure out the Chinese characters for Jandos, these pirates. I mentioned that Fortune's romanization of Chinese words had me putting on my detective hat and searching out the meaning of what he was writing. Well, that one had me stumped, so I just read it like Fortune wrote it. That was nice. So for our second selection of this episode, I thought we'd go straight into Fortune's next book, A Journey to the Tea Countries of China, including Songlo and the Bohei Tea Hills. It was published in 1852 and covers his exciting adventure made in between June of 1848 and February 1851. After he returned home from his first trip, he stayed put for 2 years. He wrote that book, which, as I said, was a big hit in its day, and before long, representatives from the East India Company approached him and gave him an offer he couldn't refuse. The top brass at the Honorable Company had read that book too, and when they put their heads together, they decided this was their man. On the first trip for the Horticultural Society of London, Robert Fortune was in his early 30s. Now, in this second trip, he was in his mid to late 30s. Over the next several episodes, We'll read excerpts from this book, and then you can judge for yourself how you feel about the whole thing. Sarah Rose, in her 2011 book, For All the Tea in China, How England Stole the World's Favorite Drink and Changed History, maintained that corporate espionage was committed. Anyway, I hope you like this story. I won't read the whole book, just parts of it. This is how it begins.
On the 14th of August, 1848, the Peninsular and Oriental Company's steamship Braganza, in which I was a passenger, dropped her anchor in the Bay of Hong Kong at 9 o'clock in the evening. In a few seconds, our decks were crowded with the inhabitants of the place, all anxious to meet their friends or to hear the news from home. As I did not intend to go on shore until the following morning, I had sufficient leisure to survey the busy and exciting scene around me. Among the numerous boats which came off to us, there were two which presented a most striking appearance. They were very long and narrow, and were each propelled by about 50 oars. They had been built by the English and American merchants to convey the news to Canton on the arrival of the mail. The moment these boats received their dispatches, they started on their journey, and, as they belonged to opposition parties, each did its best to outstrip the other. And it was often a matter of considerable importance to get the earliest news. A large sum of money was distributed amongst the crew of the winning boat. The boatmen made a great noise, Chinaman-like. All were talking, all were giving orders, for each had a stake in the winning of the race. At last, the papers, letters, or whatever they had to take, were put on board, and off they started across the bay for the mouth of the Canton or Pearl River. They plowed the water like two enormous centipedes, and, although they were going very fast, they were visible for some time in the clear moonlight. I watched them go from the deck of the steamer until they were lost in the distance, but even then, and for some time afterwards, I could hear distinctly the quick splash of the oars and the noise of the boisterous crews. Steam has now invaded the quiet waters of the Pearl River, and these boats are numbered amongst the things that were. The noise and excitement connected with the arrival of the mail gradually subsided. Those of our visitors who had been lucky enough to get hold of a Straits Times, Home News, or Times returned on shore to peruse it, while others hastened home to communicate to their friends the news they had been able to pick up from the officers or passengers of the ship. By 11 o'clock at night, all was perfectly quiet. Captain Potts and myself had our chairs taken up on deck, and we sat down to breathe the cool air and enjoy the scene by which we were surrounded. It was a clear moonlight night, such a night as one sees only in the sunny lands of the East. Those who have anchored at the Bay of Hong Kong by moonlight will agree with me that the scene at such a time is one of the grandest and most beautiful which can be imagined. On this evening, the landlocked bay was smooth as glass. Scarcely a breath of air fanned the water, and as the clear moonbeams played upon its surface, it seemed covered with glittering gems. Numerous vessels from all parts of the world lay dotted around us, their dark hulls and tall masts looming large in the distance. The view was bounded on all sides by rugged and barren hills, and it required no great stretch of fancy to imagine oneself on a highland lake. The white town of Victoria was distinctly visible from where we lay, and very pretty it appeared in the moonlight. It is built along the southern shores of the bay, and in some places extends a considerable way up the side of the hill. The background of the picture consists of a chain of rugged mountains, which are nearly 2,000 feet above the level of the sea. Altogether, the view was a charming one. When I went on shore the following morning, I found a great change had taken place since 1845. Many parts of the town, then bare, were now densely covered with houses. Our merchant princes had built themselves houses not inferior to those in the far-famed City of Palaces, and the barracks for the troops were equally handsome and expensive, although unfortunately not equally healthy. And last of all, a pretty English church was rising slowly on the hillside. An interest in gardening and planting had sprung up, which promises to lead to most satisfactory results. When I was formerly in Hong Kong, everyone complained of the barren appearance of the island and of the intense heat and glare of the sun. Officers in the army and others who had been many years in the hotter parts of India all agreed that there was a fierceness and oppressiveness in the sun's rays here, which they had never experienced in any other part of the world. From 1843 to 1845, the mortality was very great. Whole regiments were nearly swept away, and many of the government officers and merchants shared the same fate. Various opinions were expressed regarding the cause which produced these great disasters. Some said one thing and some another, although all seemed to think that imperfect drainage had something to do with it, and a hue and cry was set up to have the island properly drained. The island is a chain of mountains. There's very little flat ground anywhere upon it, and hence the water which flows from the sides of the hills gushes rapidly down towards the sea. Imperfect drainage, therefore, could have very little to do with its unhealthiness. I've always thought that, although various causes may operate to render Hong Kong unhealthy, yet one of the principal reasons is the absence of trees and of the shade which they afford. In a communication which I had the honor to make to the government here in 1844, I pointed out this circumstance and strongly recommended them to preserve the wood then growing upon the island from the Chinese, who were in the habit of cutting it down annually, and at the same time to plant extensively, particularly on the sides of the roads and on the lower hills. I am happy to say that these recommendations have been carried out to a certain extent, although not so fully as I had wished. It is well known that a healthy vegetation, such as shrubs and trees, decomposes the carbonic acid of the atmosphere and renders it fit for respiration, besides which there is a softness and coolness about trees, particularly in a hot climate, that is always agreeable. Having nothing to detain me in Hong Kong, I took the earliest opportunity of going northwards to Shanghai. This town is the most northerly of the 5 ports at which foreigners are permitted to trade, and is situated nearly 1,000 miles northeast from Hong Kong. In 1844, I published an account of it in the Athenaeum, and in 1846 I described it more fully in my Wanderings. In both these works, I ventured to point it out as a place likely to become of great importance both to England and America, as a port of trade, easy of access from the sea. Taking into consideration its proximity to the large towns of Hangzhou, Suzhou, and the ancient capital of Nanjing, the large native trade, the convenience of inland transit by means of rivers and canals, the fact that teas can be brought here more readily than to Canton, and lastly, viewing this place as an immense mart for our cotton manufactures, there can be no doubt that in a few years it will not only rival Canton, but become a place of far greater importance. When these remarks were written, the war had just been brought to a satisfactory termination, and the Treaty of Nanjing had been wrung from the Chinese. The first merchant ship had entered the river. 1 or 2 English merchants had arrived, and we were living in wretched Chinese houses, eating with chopsticks, half-starved with cold, and sometimes drenched in bed with rain. When the weather happened to be frosty, we not unfrequently found the floors of our rooms in the morning covered with snow. A great change has taken place since those days. I now found myself, September 1848, after having been in England for nearly 6 years, once more in a China boat sailing up the Shanghai River towards the city. The first object which met my view as I approached the town was a forest of masts, not of junks only, which had been so striking on former occasions, but of goodly foreign ships, chiefly from England and the United States of America. There were now 26 large vessels at anchor here, many of which had come loaded with the produce of our manufacturing districts, and were returning filled with silks and teas. But I was much more surprised with the appearance which the shore presented than with the shipping. I had heard that many English and American houses had been built. Indeed, 1 or 2 were being built before I left China. But a new town of very considerable size now occupied the place of wretched Chinese hovels, cotton fields, and tombs. The Chinese were moving gradually backwards into the country, with their families, effects, and all that appertained unto them, reminding one of the aborigines of the West, with this important difference, that the Chinese generally left of their free will and were liberally remunerated for their property by the foreigners. Their chief care was to remove with their other effects the bodies of their deceased friends, which are commonly interred on private property near their houses. Hence it was no uncommon thing to meet several coffins being borne by coolies or friends to the westward. In many instances, when the coffins were uncovered, they were found totally decayed, and it was impossible to remove them. When this was the case, a Chinese might be seen holding a book in his hand, which contained a list of the bones, and directing others in their search after these, the last remnants of mortality. It is most amusing to see the groups of Chinese merchants who come from some distance inland on a visit to Shanghai. They wander about along the riverside with wonder depicted in their countenances. The square-rigged vessels which crowd the river, the houses of the foreigners, their horses, and their dogs, are all objects of wonder, even more so than the foreigners themselves. Mr. Beale, who has one of the finest houses here, has frequent applications from the respectable Chinese who are anxious to see the inside of an English dwelling. These applications are always complied with in the kindest manner, and the visitors depart, highly delighted with the view. It is to be hoped that these peeps at our comforts and refinements may have a tendency to raise the barbarian race a step or two higher in the eyes of the enlightened Chinese. My object in coming thus far north was to obtain seeds and plants of the tea shrub for the Honorable East India Company's plantations in the northwest provinces of India. It was a matter of great importance to procure them from those districts in China where the best teas were produced, and I now set about accomplishing this object. There were various tea districts near Ningbo where very fair green teas were prepared for Chinese use, but these teas were not very well suited to the foreign market. It might be that the plant was precisely the same variety from which the finer sorts were made, and that the difference consisted only in climate, in soil, or, more likely still, in a different mode of manipulation. This might or might not be the case. No one, so far as I knew, had ever visited the Huizhou district and brought away plants from the tea hills there. In these circumstances, I considered that it would be a most unsatisfactory proceeding to procure plants and seeds from the Ningbo district only, or to take it for granted that they were the same as those in the great green tea country of Huizhou. It was a very easy matter to get plants and seeds from the tea countries near Ningbo. Foreigners are allowed to visit the islands in the Zhoushan archipelago, such as Zhoushan and Jintang, in both of which the tea shrub is most abundant. They can also go to the celebrated temple of Tiantong, about 20 miles inland, in the neighborhood of which tea is cultivated upon an extensive scale. But the Huizhou district is upwards of 200 miles inland from either of the northern ports of Shanghai or Ningbo. It is a sealed country to Europeans. If we accept the Jesuit missionaries, no one has ever entered within the sacred precincts of Huizhou, although since this was written I have been informed that the Reverend Mr. Medhurst passed through some part of this district. Having determined, if possible, to procure plants and seeds from this celebrated country, there were but two ways of proceeding in the business. Either Chinese agents must be employed to go into the country to procure them and bring them down, or I must go there myself. At first sight, the former way seemed the only one possible. Certainly it was the easiest, but there were some very formidable objections to this course. Suppose I engaged Chinese agents for this purpose, and plenty would have undertaken the mission. How could I be at all certain that the plants or seeds which they would have brought me had been obtained in the districts in question? No dependence can be placed upon the veracity of the Chinese. I may seem uncharitable, but such is really the case, and if it suited the purpose of the agents employed in this matter, they would have gone a few miles inland to the nearest tea district, one which I could have visited myself with ease and safety, and have made up their collection there. After staying away for a month or two, they would have returned to me with the collection and, if requisite, have sworn that they had obtained it in the country to which I had desired them to proceed. It is just possible that they might have done otherwise, but even if they had, I could not have been certain that such was the case, and I therefore abandoned all idea of managing the business in that way, and determined to make an effort to penetrate into the Huizhou country myself, where I could not only procure the true plants which produce the finest green teas of commerce, but also gain some information with regard to the nature of the soil of the district and the best modes of cultivation. I had 2 Huizhou men in my service at this time. I sent for them and inquired whether it was possible to penetrate so far into the country. They replied that we could easily do so, and that they were quite willing to accompany me, only stipulating that I should discard my English costume and adopt the dress of the country. I knew that this was indispensable if I wished to accomplish the object in view, and readily acceded to the terms. My servants now procured me a Chinese dress, and had the tail which I had worn in former years nicely dressed by the barber. Everything was soon in readiness except the boat which had to be engaged for the first stage of our journey. This was just then a difficult matter, owing to some boatmen having been severely punished by the Chinese authorities for taking 3 or 4 foreigners some distance inland to see the silk districts. These gentlemen went in the English dress, and complaints were consequently made by the officers in the districts through which they had passed to the mandarins in Shanghai. On this account, it was impossible to engage a boat as a foreigner, and I desired my servant to hire it in his own name, and merely state that 2 other persons were to accompany him. He agreed to this plan, and soon returned with a chop, or agreement which he had entered into with a man who engaged to take us as far as the city of Hangzhou. Thus far, all was right, but now my two men began to be jealous of each other, each wanting to manage the concern, with the view, as it proved ultimately, of getting as many dollars out of me as possible. One of them had been engaged as a servant and linguist, and the other was a little better than a common coolie. I therefore entrusted the management of our affairs to the former, much to the disgust of the other, who was an older man. In an ordinary case, I would have sent one of them away, but as I had but little confidence in either, I thought that in their present jealous state, the one would prove a check upon the other. The projected journey was a long one, the way was unknown to me, and I should have been placed in an awkward position had they agreed to rob me, and then run off and leave me when far inland. The jealous feeling that existed between them was therefore, I considered, rather a safeguard than otherwise. As I was anxious to keep the matter as secret as possible, I intended to have left the English part of the town at night in a chair, and gone on board the boat near to the east gate of the city, where she lay moored in the river. Greatly to my surprise, however, I observed a boat, such as I knew mine to be, alongside one of the English jetties, and apparently ready for my reception. "Is that the boat you have engaged?" said I to my servant Wang. "Yes," said he. "That coolie has gone and told the boatman all about the matter, and that an Englishman is going in his boat. But will the boatman consent to go now?" "Oh, yes," he replied, "if you only add a trifle more to the fare." To this I consented, and after a great many delays, everything was at last pronounced to be ready for our starting. As the boatman knew who I was, I went on board in my English dress, and kept it on during the first day. When I rose in the morning of the second day, we were some distance from Shanghai, and the boatman suggested that it was now time to discard the English dress and adopt that of the country, according to our agreement. To put on the dress was an easy matter, but I also had to get my head shaved, an operation which required a barber. Wang, who was the most active of my two men, was laid up that morning with fever and ague, so that the duty devolved upon the coolie. The latter was a large-boned, clumsy fellow, whose only recommendation to me was his being a native of that part of the country to which I was bound. Having procured a pair of scissors, he clipped the hair from the front, back, and sides of my head, leaving only a patch upon the crown. He then washed those parts with hot water, after the manner of the Chinese, and having done so, he took up a small razor and began to shave my head. I suppose I must have been the first person upon whom he had ever operated, and I am charitable enough to wish most sincerely that I may be the last. He did not shave, he actually scraped my poor head until the tears came running down my cheeks, and I cried out in pain. All he said was, "Hi-ya, very bad, and continued the operation. To make matters worse, and to try my temper more, the boatmen were peeping into the cabin and evidently enjoying the whole affair and thinking it capital sport. I really believe I should have made a scene of a less amusing kind had I not been restrained by my prudential motives, and by the consideration that the poor coolie was really doing the best he could. The shaving was finished at last. I then dressed myself in the costume of the country, and the result was pronounced by my servants and boatmen to be very satisfactory. The whole country to the westward of Shanghai is intersected with rivers and canals, so that the traveler can visit by boat almost all the towns and cities in this part of the province. Some of the canals lead to the large cities of Songjiang, Suzhou, Nanjing, and onward by the Grand Canal to the capital itself. Others, again, running to the west and southwest, form the highways to the Tartar city of Jiapu, Hangzhou, and to numerous other cities and towns, which are studded over this large and important plain. We proceeded in a southwesterly direction, my destination being the city of Hangzhou. Having a fair wind during the first day, we got as far as the Mao Lake, a distance of 120 or 130 li from Shanghai. Here we stopped for the night, making our boat fast to a post driven into the grassy banks of the lake. Starting early next morning, we reached in the forenoon a town of considerable size named Jiaxingyuan, and a little farther on we came to the city of Jiaxing, a large place walled and fortified. This city seems nearly as large as Shanghai, and probably contains about the same number of inhabitants, 270,000. Its walls and ramparts had been in a most dilapidated and ruinous condition, but the people got such a fright when the English took Jiapu, which is not a very great distance off, that they came forward with funds and had the defenses of their city substantially repaired. Such was the boatman's story when accounting for the excellent order in which the fortifications were. A number of old grain junks, of great size considering the depth of water, are moored in the canal abreast of the city, and are apparently used as dwelling houses by the natives. Some, however, are half sunk in the water and appear entirely abandoned. Junks of the same description as these are seen abreast of all the large towns in the Grand Canal. When too old for the government service, they seem to be drawn up to the nearest city and either used by government officers as dwelling houses or sold to the highest bidder.
Okay, that was that. You're all set up now for Robert Fortune's second adventure in China. He's at his imperialist, snooty best. Next time when we meet, we'll pick up where we left off and continue this journey. If you're someone interested in tea, you'll for sure appreciate these next few episodes. If I'm lucky, perhaps Lou and NYC will tweet about it. So, until we meet again, miei amici, this is Laszlo Montgomery of the China Vintage Hour. Be sure to listen to the China History Podcast if you haven't had a chance to check that one out. We're related. All part of the Teacup Media empire. Contact me anytime if you have access to any antiquarian books that are right for this program. Feel free to recommend them to me. Take care, everyone. See you next time.